What is a man? It comes down to three irreducible things. A man is biology, so genes, right? Bell curves, all this kind of stuff. A man is also psychology, so he thinks he's a man, or whatever it means to him to be a man, and culture. What defines a man is different in Thailand than it is in Texas. Yet Thai men are every bit as much men as Texas men. So a man is an irreducible thing, combination of psychology, biology, culture. The people on the right, they tend to pump up biology and they tend to sort of negate psychology and culture. People on the left tend to pump up culture and psychology and try to bump down biology. And to me, both sides are often full of shit when they talk about things in this kind of way, because the truth is it needs to be all three of those things. So welcome everyone to another episode of The Integral Edge. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I am the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy, which is a look at the integration of spiritual practice and shadow work. I work as a leadership coach and a transition coach with men and women, and I also work as a book coach. In fact, I'm working on quite a few books right now, including one with Terry O'Fallon, where we're writing the first ever Stages book about her theory. And I'm writing a book, it's actually about 90% finished, called Strength with Heart, with Daniel Ellenberg and Fred Rabinowitz, both PhDs in psychology. And that one is all about what I'm going to talk about today, which is masculinity, men's work, the crisis that's happening with men today, etc. So very happy to be here and to speak about this topic. I have a lot of passion around this topic and a lot of interest. I've been in a men's group here in Boulder, Colorado, almost the whole time I've been here. So I think we're 17 years running with the same group of men. And it's an interesting thing being in a men's group. I remember when I was first asked to join it, all those years ago, 17 years ago, I was in my 30s. And my friend Casey said, "Hey, we're doing this thing. We have this men's group. Would you like to join?" And my response was, why would I want to be in a group of men? The way I'd been raised, the culture in which I'd raised, I didn't particularly trust men. I didn't particularly like men. Bullies, athletes, jocks, status, bros, frat guys, hated all those things. And I just didn't have a very good association with men. And so my own process over the last 2 decades, has been part of the process that I'm going to walk us through today. And just so you know, this is a huge topic, right? I mean, the idea of men and masculinity and what's going on. And this is really just meant to be a bit of a primer for this conversation. I want to have a few more conversations about this and bring in some experts, of people that certainly know more about this kind of thing than I do. But I just thought it would be nice to whet our appetites a little bit and to get sort of an overview of the land. So that's the goal for today. If you have questions or comments, feel free to chat them in when I'm speaking. I may or may not be able to look at it. It's hard to do when I'm doing this solo. It's easier to do it if I'm interviewing someone. But I'll certainly answer all the questions at the end, to the best of my ability. Okay, so one of the curious things that is happening in 2025 is that virtually everybody that I know knows what toxic masculinity is. But no one can define healthy masculinity, which is interesting, right? As men, we're told what we're not supposed to be, but what we are supposed to be is very nebulous. In fact, on my Facebook profile yesterday, a woman sort of posted her idea of what that meant as if it was obvious. And it was an integral language. It was a very sort of green meme, pluralistic, equity, equality, inclusion, listening, that kind of stuff. That's one version of masculinity. the trouble is right now men are really, collectively, we're in an identity crisis. The social scripts of the past, the way our fathers were, stoicism, loyalty, hard work, discipline, sacrifice, emotional coolness. These were all things that we were raised in, and they don't fit anymore. And we had the MeToo movement, and the MeToo movement was very necessary and very needed. But I think a lot of good guys kind of got the wrong message from that movement, which was, don't take up any space, don't raise your voice, don't speak up. And I personally know a number of men who have basically just checked out of the dating scene completely. They're in their 40s or 50s, they're materially successful. And they've just thrown their hands up and walked away. So, and the consequences of this lack of identity, they're staggering, they're mounting, right? There's addiction, there's suicide, there's rampant porn use, there's loneliness, all these things. A lot of guys, they're excelling professionally, but quietly they're disintegrating and sort of falling to pieces. I work as a coach, I work with a lot of men, and I see this firsthand all the time. So, what is a man? I gave a talk on that, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so. It's on the Integral Life page, so you can look for it. I think it's also on YouTube, but what is a man? And in that talk, I say that a man, it's actually a fairly simple talk. It should be pretty obvious, but in today's charged times, maybe it's not as obvious as it should be. But what is a man? Well, what is a man? It's the same thing as what is a woman. It comes down to three irreducible things. A man is biology, which I get into in great detail in that talk. I'm not going to get into it here. So biology, so genes, right? Bell curves, all this kind of stuff. A man is also psychology, so he thinks he's a man, or whatever it means to him to be a man, and culture. As I said in that talk, what defines a man is different in Thailand than it is in Texas. Yet Thai men are every bit as much men as Texas men. So a man is an irreducible thing, combination of psychology, biology, culture. The people on the right, they tend to pump up biology and they tend to sort of negate psychology and culture. People on the left tend to pump up culture and psychology and try to bump down biology. And to me, both sides are often full of shit when they talk about things in this kind of way, because the truth is it needs to be all three of those things. Okay. So go look at that talk if you want to hear more on that. Today, we're talking about masculinity. Now, masculinity, by definition, is bound to culture. And, the idea is like masculinity, it's a moving target because it depends on the era and the culture in which it's arising. That's going to be more important, the most important thing. So what's masculine in a feudal village is different than a Victorian household, and that's different than if you're on you're a Lakota warrior, in 1850, and that's different than if you're a startup tech founder, right? They're all different versions of what masculinity is, and each one kind of defaults to it's the way it's supposed to be. So they also have sort of a projection, you would say, of what masculinity should be. So, as most of us look out over the world today, we can see kind of four broad types of masculinity if we open our eyes. And if we take sort of a lazy look, we'll see sort of the power-based masculinity of like an Andrew Tate, or this is the quote unquote toxic masculinity that so much of Me Too was pushing back against. Conquesting, achievement, unhealthy achievement, women as objects, fancy sports car, acquisition, status, zero vulnerability, zero emotional awareness, right? Vulnerability is weakness. That's a direct line for the power-based folks. We also, as we look at culture, we see traditional masculinity, right? This is our cops, our firemen, our soldiers, traditional religious people. This is stoic, principled, protective, duty without complaint, emotionally tamped down again, emotionally unexpressed, anger safe, things like that. We have the modern man. And this is, the rational, achievement-driven guy, right? This is intellect over ambition, ambition over intimacy. Intellect over emotion, ambition over intimacy. And we could think of like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates as examples of this. Pretty much any man that's successful in the modern West is some version of this intellect over emotion and ambition over intimacy kind of thing. And then, of course, we have pluralism, or the postmodern thing, where we've sort of flipped the script a little bit, and their masculinity, like the woman on my Facebook page, that's about empathy and emotional fluency and inclusion and being aware of patriarchy and privilege and all these things. And we might look to like Trevor Noah or Barack Obama as examples of this. But here's the point, people. Each one of those four versions, they contain a definition of masculinity, a sliver of masculinity, but none of them capture the whole. Okay? Even if we take them all together, it doesn't capture the whole, which I'll explain. So what's needed now is not a new definition, but a new relationship to the question itself. That's what we're going to get into today, briefly. Okay. So, when I moved to Boulder in the mid-2000s, 2006, I was introduced to David Data and his way of the superior man and his particular views on masculinity. And David Data's model, in essence, has three stages of masculinity. The first stage is kind of the macho man, or the power-seeking one. This could be like an Andrew Tate type, right? This is a guy who's all about success, power, sex. Women are objects of pleasure and status. Other men are competitors, right? Rather than allies or brothers. There's a lot of domination and control and immaturity, and there's fear of vulnerability. They have no spiritual center. Basically, they're the stereotypical alpha male. Ambitious, confident, emotionally unavailable, and narcissistic. And if there was a phrase that defined the first stage man, according to David Data, it would be, quote, "This man uses the world to feel full," end quote. So in other words, it's up to the world to make them feel better about themselves. That's David Data's first stage masculine. His second stage masculine, he calls the nice guy. And to me, well, I'll get into it. Let me explain the theory, and then I'll get into my criticism of it. His second stage masculine is the nice guy, like the nice woman on my Facebook wall. Equity, sensitivity, relational intelligence. Here, the guy focuses on balance and fairness and partnership and personal growth, right? He's a good Boulder guy. He's a good Bay Area guy. He strives for equality with women. He avoids domination and aggression. He's more spiritually open, right? He probably does yoga. Maybe he meditates. Maybe he's a vegan. This is the conscious man who supports feminism, who meditates, who prioritizes conscious relationship. And Data would say, well, the shadow here, or the problem here, is self-castration or poor boundaries, confusion around gender polarity, passivity, lack of purpose, lack of agency, lack of power, right? That's what he would say. So this man, Data would say this man's better than the first stage man, doing less harm. We would be much better off if there were more men in the second stage than the first stage, obviously. And Data says this man is sort of fundamentally self-castrated. His third stage masculine, this would be his sort of integrated man. This is about presence and depth and devotion. Here, the focus is on embodied purpose, spiritual realization, and deep penetrative love. This man loves others fearlessly, penetrates the world. Data's really big on penetration, if you get the metaphor. Penetrating the world with his presence, holding the feminine with devotion, not need. He says this is basically a very spiritually alive and awake man, deep. He's sort of transcended and moved past his egoic needs by connection to source or God or oneness or whatever. And the shadow, data says, is basically doesn't exist. This third stage man has almost no shadow, or the little shadows that arise, he can sort of manhandle, if you will, very quickly and efficiently. And so this guy lives as love itself, right? So a couple of things here. One, this model is laughably simplistic. Okay, so it's a nice overview, but to go from Andrew Tate to Trevor Noah as his first stage, second stage, with no transition, with nothing in between, and then to go from first to second, and then the third, his third stage masculine is a man that I've never met. I'll just be frank, and I've met David Data and work with him one-on-one quite a bit. The third stage masculine is kind of, in my view, an idealized archetype. It doesn't really exist because I have yet to meet any human being, any spiritual master, no exceptions, that isn't still really working with their own shadow material. And if they're not working with their shadow material, it's usually not good for the people around them. So that's why I wrote When the Buddha Needs Therapy. It's kind of an angle of mine. So the trouble with Data's model, in my view, is that it's overly simplistic. It's a little naive. It doesn't take shadow and trauma and unconscious bullshit seriously enough. And to me, it doesn't honor the much more complex layers and things that describe the different ways that masculinity arises in most cultures in the world, but certainly in the Western cultures, and I'll stick there because that's my area of expertise because I live here. So you might notice that in Data's model, and often in the integral model itself, when we talk about power-based cultures or power-based individuals, read in integral language, people that are pre-Amber, pre-rule based, it's usually done in a very negative, judgy kind of a way. So the drives and impulses of red or / power, which would be where most of humanity was, for most of our existence, is viewed as sort of negative and destructive and toxic and, this sort of thing. And part of what I want to point out in this talk is that power-based, traditional, modern, and pluralistic movements, types of masculinity, not movements, they all have healthy and unhealthy components to them, and they all have places where they can be non-domineering and places where all of them can be domineering. So these are really important distinctions, right? You can have a power-based culture and it not be domineering. Absolutely. Seems counterintuitive because the examples we give are often like the mafia or inner city gangs, things like that, which are not healthy examples of power-based cultures. They're unhealthy examples of power-based cultures, or they're examples of unhealthy power-based cultures. I think they're healthy examples. So So what's an example of a healthy power-based culture, Keith? Oh, I'm glad you asked. So, we can look at a lot of things. Like we can look at the Zulu warriors, right? Their creed was about combat prowess, lineage, wisdom, the ability to protect their own people. The Zulu chief, he wasn't just a warrior, right? He didn't just fight. He was also a mediator, a protector. He was part of the ritual center of the tribe. His masculine power was legitimized only when it served the collective. Service. The traits of these types of warriors, these sort of traditional, tribal warriors, discipline, courage, presence, for sure. deep embodiment, deeply in the body, really mastery over the body, mastery over the weapons that are used as an expression of being a warrior. Think the Iroquois and the Lakota, the Comanches. I mean, just vicious warriors, deeply in their body, could do things that just blew the colonial powers away. Their mastery with their weapons was only because they were outgunned and ultimately overpowered by numbers, that they didn't hold the line everywhere we encountered them. But the masculine trait there is a deep responsibility for the moral and physical well-being of their people. Power was tied to responsibility, people, right? It's not Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate isn't responsible for anything but what he wants. He's a selfish fucking narcissist, right? Unhealthy. Healthy powers there. Now, what's the point? Why am I bringing this up? Because as men in the masculine, part of what we need to do is find the healthy parts of this power, these power-based cultures, and bring that into our lives if we need it. I know a lot of men that could use a little more power in their life, a little more embodiment. Do you? So we think of people in our current culture that maybe are oriented more around this developmental fulcrum, or have more skill or wisdom or power here, or accomplishment. We could think of like a Muhammad Ali or any great physical athlete like that. David Goggins, you know who David Goggins is? You got to look him up. He's a maniac in a great way. T.H. Lawrence of Arabia, Wim Hof, right? So what do these guys have? Well, they're unmediated by institutions, right? They are the structure that they create. They don't give a shit about institutions. They don't give a shit about the rules, right? They have presence over politeness. They don't care if you like them. Muhammad Ali is a great example. Charming guy, and really willing to speak the truth to power back in his day in a way that was powerful. Embodiment over ideology, directness over diplomacy, courage over conformity, ferocity in service, not in ego. Okay? So that's what the healthy version of red looks like. And as we define masculinity, well, we want some of that red energy, right? I mean, if someone breaks into my home, I bet my partner wants me to get into some of this fierce, embodied, protective space. She probably doesn't want me to sit down and do a processing circle with him and get into his trauma and find out, what's gone wrong, that he's now breaking into our home and threatening us with a gun. That's probably not the right tool for the right situation, right? Traditional masculinity, right? So now we're going to move up to traditional masculinity, which is much more present in our culture, much more obvious to spot. So healthy traditional values: stoicism, honor, loyalty, duty, service before self, protection, discipline, sacrifice. So some things, right, that are being pulled forth from red or from the so-called power-based into traditional. But we can think of like Winston Churchill, right, as a great example of traditional values. Someone who, through stoicism and loyalty to the country and a duty to serve, is able to really go beyond the limitations of themselves at great cost, right? The cost is the emotional landscape of their inner world, because still here, vulnerability is a liability. And being emotionally vulnerable is equated still with being weak, same way it is in the previous thing, right? I mean, Wim Hof and Lawrence of Arabia and, what else did I say? Goggins and things like, they don't really talk about being afraid. They don't talk about places where they've really gone beyond what they can handle and become frightened and, screwed up and made huge mistakes and learned hard lessons. And the vulnerabilities, and that's not part of what they're up to. So as we look at the definition of masculinity, I ask the men out there, women that are with them, men that are with them, it's like, could any of us use more stoicism, honor, loyalty, duty, service, protective energy, discipline, self-sacrifice? Would having some of those qualities define you be a good thing? Probably, right? Maybe not all of them, maybe just a couple of them. Maybe you have those qualities in spades. Right? The whole point here is that if I have 10 guys in a room that I'm working with, a couple of them might need a lot more traditional masculine values. They might need more discipline and honor and principle. Hey man, get out of your own fucking head. Get off the U train. Pay attention to your family. Stop doing endless therapy, staring at your navel, get your head out of your ass. Show up for people, right? That could be one group, one guy in the group. And somebody else, I might be like, you're so stuck in your loyal, protective service mode that you have no inner life. You're actually miserable and you're suffering and you're modeling really bad things. Your wife is unhappy. Your kids can't feel you. You're doing what's necessary, but your inner life is in ruins and you're not helping the people around you. You're not serving them as well as you could if you could open to some more of these maybe modern and pluralistic masculine traits, which we'll get into right now. All right, so modern masculinity. So this is like self-mastery, achievement, strategy, autonomy, independence, ethical ambition, emotional self-regulation. So the modern masculine has more access to emotion than traditional masculine, for sure, 100%. But that emotion is self-regulated because it's still seen as a bit of a liability, right? Excess emotion, it's a bit feminine, he says with a little bit of a roll to the eyes. Excess emotion makes me look weak, right? How can I be the leader of the company if I have too much emotion? Emotions equal weakness. So there's a real problem, real issue here with the integrated emotions and understanding emotions on a deeper level and what they can actually bring to us. So, the modern masculine, it's rational, it's skilled, it's confident, successful, strategic, innovative, right? Like, just think, the entire scientific revolution as an example of this, or the Enlightenment in the West, right? I spent the last talk that I gave on America talking a great deal about the modern masculine creation of the Enlightenment principle of enlightened self-interest. I give a whole talk on that and the U.S. Constitution and why that matters and why it's relevant. These are great, right? Some of us need to be more rational and skilled and confident and successful and strategic and innovative, right? That's some things those are masculine traits that, could probably be helpful for some men. What's the downside? Well, the downside, the shadow here is workaholism, burnout, emotionally distant and avoidant, objectification of others, right? Status addiction, cynicism, nihilism, obliviousness to things like privilege or status. The people can become, or nature can become instruments of success. There can be emotional repression. There can be an addiction to external successes and on, right? So like the two that come before it, there are proficient and deficient aspects of these kinds of masculinity. All right, pluralistic masculinity. So we talked about this, the idea of the Trevor Noahs, the Barack Obamas. This pluralistic masculinity really comes about in the 60s, and it's where the social construction of reality becomes a thing that can be seen. It's where the culture moves from orange to green for you integralists out there, right? And the idea is that, we can see for the first time that, oh, like the idea of gender is kind of a construct, right? Like, what is feminine anyway? What is masculine? These are kind of things that culture decides, arbitrarily, and creates definitions and then roles and then, systems of oppression and power and money and influence and we're off to the races, right? But the idea of pluralistic masculinity are things like emotional attunement, seeing power structures and historical inequities, which modernity can do too, for sure, but modernity can only see them when they're concrete, i.e. redlining, systematic oppression, like, the way the tax structures force poor communities to have worse schools, which locks them into a pattern of continuing poverty. The way the GI Bill excluded blacks, whites only drinking fountains, whites only colleges. These are kind of hard to miss. They're concrete in that you can point to them with your finger. And modern masculinity can see those things. Postmodern masculinity can see further. They can see into systemic things. The idea that a bunch of modern scientists could have a bunch of unconscious sexist views that they're not tracking consciously, and they could create a culture of hostility and toxicity and make women not want to work there, that kind of stuff. So the pluralistic man can see power structures and historic inequities. They're relational, they're supportive, they have emotional fluency, they have empathy beyond their tribe, group, or a pragmatic view of the world. They can be vulnerable for the first time, like genuinely vulnerable. They can be inclusive. They have relational integrity. They believe in consent and mutuality, cultural humility. They can spot toxic norms. So there's a lot of really good traits for pluralistic masculinity. The negatives are self-erasure, disowned strength, relativism, emotional oversensitivity. Performative empathy, that's a big one. Tribal moralism, endless deconstruction without rebuilding. So I get into this in my last talk on DEI from a few months ago, if you're interested in me breaking this down. Not so much along gender lines, but just around the mindset, the problems that can arise from a pluralistic mindset when it tries to apply equity. So the problems here are as obvious and glaring and potentially destructive as they are in any of the other three, right? So what we need is to be able to access all of these different kinds of masculine identities, which some of them women are going to do, right? Like, let's not get hung up on the idea of even trying to define it as a lost cause, because it isn't, right? It's like masculinity. There was a Supreme Court justice in the 60s. I forget his name. Potter, maybe? Potter? I can't remember. But he was asked for a definition of pornography. And he said, well, I know it when I see it. And in some sense, masculinity is the same way, right? You know what masculinity is. I mean, we could walk down the street and I would say, point out a masculine guy. And you're going to go, well, that guy and that guy. And those four guys. And you might not even know why you know it, right? And if I ask a ton of questions, it might start to break down and fall apart, right? But it's something that's in the ether that we have a sense of, right? I'm trying to broaden that intuitive sense and to give men a broader context of words, of behavioral types, of archetypal energies that they can inhabit depending on who they are. As I said, one guy might need to be a lot more emotionally intelligent, have more empathy, and have more willingness to listen and be more conscious. That might be his path of growth. And a different guy might need more discipline, stoicism, service beyond self, and etc. Right? So it's not a cookie cutter thing. What I don't like about the David Data thing is that it's too simple, right? That for him, the stage 3 man is basically a superhero that has evolved beyond any reactivity of any kind. It's just not realistic. And the stage 2 man, in his view, is the pluralistic man, but he presents the pluralistic man as something that's inherently unfulfilled. But I would argue that any of the 4 types are unfulfilled: power-based, traditional, modern, or pluralistic, right? Because ultimately, our sense of self, our sense of identity is a construct at the deepest level, right? You don't exist in the way that you think you exist. Your entire identity is a construct of culture and self, right? You're real, but you're not true, maybe is how I would say it. So much of who we think we are just thoughts and ideas strung together over time and reinforced by the culture in which we live. But they don't go so far. They don't hold up under too much scrutiny, and they all start to fall apart a little bit when we push on them because they're actually not that deep. So that's an important thing to hold at any of these things. Okay. So, power-based cultures can become domineering, right? They're not domineering by nature. They're domineering in our culture when we see them, largely because we see, like I said, the mafia, the inner city gang, things like that. But at its core, a power-based masculinity is rooted in force, charisma, presence, and command. Okay? It emerged in tribal and warrior cultures where survival depended on strength. Duh. Leadership was often earned through direct action, right? Not titles, not inheritances, not aristocratic land ownership. It was the strong, the best warrior rules because survival depends on him. Duh, pretty simple. But as I mentioned, that most of these tribal cultures actually did this with heart. They did it with service. Now, they were savagely violent against people that weren't in their tribe. It could be savagely violent. I mean, the Comanche could be violent on a level that's staggering. So could the Viking raiders and the berserkers. And history is replete with the mind-boggling violence that warrior cultures are capable of against someone that's not in their tribe. So power-based cultures become domineering when the power goes out of relationship to service, when it becomes really just about a despotic ruler, and when it becomes just about power. And history is replete with examples, right? I mean, warlords all over the world today, despotic kings, despotic rulers, right? That are they're despotic, right? They're beyond the law. The law doesn't apply to them. They apply their authority and their ruthlessness in an arbitrary and capricious manner. Their women are very much used as cattle, as objects, as a means to an end. Harems and spreading their progeny as far and as wide as they can. And right, this is all that it's not hard for power-based cultures to become domineering, but they don't have to. And there's lots of examples where they're not. The dominator logic here is I lead because I can, I take because I want, I rule because no one can stop me. That's dominator power logic. Okay. Traditional cultures. Now, traditional cultures have a lot of virtues as we've seen. Throughout history, there's been lots of traditional cultures that have kept the barbarians at the gate. You look at the Eastern Roman Empire. It was for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years a sort of bastion of light and learning and education and monastic passing down of knowledge and all sorts of wonderful things that really helped culture survive. But as we can see in places like the United States and micro communities, traditional communities, without heart, right, righteousness emerges from tradition. And it can be unnatural and arbitrary. There can be all sorts of weird hierarchies, right? Like back in the day, the unnatural hierarchy of the traditional religious was God to archangels to angels to men to women to animals, right, and on down. That's the hierarchy of command and power and God-given authority. So the dominator logic for traditional cultures is I'm in charge because I deserve to be, and I will punish and destroy you if you threaten the rule of law. And I stand at the top of the rule of law. Modern cultures can also become domineering, right? We see this all over the place in our world today. So domination here comes through a presumption of earned power, intelligence, and control. So the dominator here, they're dressed in suits and they're backed by KPIs and market wins. It could be a male scientist who's arrogantly dismissing the insights of a female colleague or taking credit for her work. Domination comes through scale, persuasion, branding, right? And the logic here is I'm on top because I deserve it. I earned my way here. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. It's because of my brilliance that I created this company. And, I deserve what I get. Becomes domineering. Pluralistic cultures, folks. Pluralistic cultures can be every bit as domineering as modern, traditional, and power-based ones. Every bit. This is what, in some ways, Trump's re-election is a reaction to, right? The bullshit of the DEI movements, right? I spoke about this a lot. There's a lot of good in the DEI stuff. There's a lot of things I support, and there's a lot of bullshit. They basically, virtue can become toxically virtuous, right? So here, pluralistic, it dominates through moral superiority. And so they say things like, you're not just wrong, but you're dangerous, right? That's a dangerous idea, Keith. It's like, a dangerous idea. Well, then you should ban the idea, I guess, right? Wouldn't that be the ethical thing to do? Here domination creates these sort of coercive structures, like if you were truly inclusive, you'd agree with us. Well, that's an open invitation, right? Or any disagreement with us is a sign of your own privilege and fragility. Exclusion here is often reinforced through shame or group cancellation. It's not through violence, but there's still a power dynamic and it's still hierarchical. There's still an in-group and an out-group, and if you're not in the in-group, you're in the out-group, and we cast you out and we judge you. So the dominator logic here is I'm right because I care more, because I feel more, because I represent the oppressed. Right? Very dangerous. Very, very dangerous stuff. The point is that any kind of masculinity can turn into dominance and shadow. Pluralism, modernism, traditionalism, etc. Okay. So what? I mean, what does this have to do with anything, right? Is this a philosophy talk, or is this about masculinity? Pardon me. Down the wrong pipe there. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to integrate the best of these four kinds of masculinity. We need to be aware of them philosophically, intellectually. We need to understand them somatically. Very important. We need to have a sense of where we own these sorts of things or where we have them in shadow. And we need support in filling them out so we can be a whole man. So for me, a healthy whole man, he doesn't reject any stage of masculine development. He integrates the best of all of them. So he embodies power-based masculinity when courage, raw presence, or fierce protection are called for. He honors traditional masculinity when discipline, loyalty, or service to others matters most. He draws on modern masculinity when strategic thinking, autonomy, or mastery is needed. And he lives into pluralistic masculinity when empathy, reflection, and relational depth are what's required. None of these are better or worse. They're all tools that can be in a man's toolbox, pun intended. The question isn't which kind of masculinity you identify with. It's not the question. The question is, what part of yourself have you underdeveloped or abandoned? That's where the work is. For some men, the work is reclaiming their power, their spine, their voice, their balls, their capacity to act without seeking permission. For some men, it's reconnecting with discipline and honor, learning to keep their word and carry the weight that it isn't always fun or exciting to do that. It's not all about you. Still, others might need to strengthen their vision and execution, learning to create, lead, and build in the world, right? If you don't have any money, you're not gaming capitalism. You're just being had by capitalism. I hate to tell you. And some men need to soften into empathy and connection, to stop performing and to start feeling. Right? What's really going on with you? What's really going on in your heart, brother? Like, how is that for you? How you doing? My Zen teacher, Junpo, he used to get people by just saying really genuinely, how you doing? How you doing? Some people would break into tears. So the path of masculinity is not linear. It's cyclical, it's responsive, it's deeply personal. There's no one size fits all. There's only the man who knows what part of himself he needs to grow next, and then the courage to do it. Okay, so some men are home in tradition, some men are home in tenderness. Some lead with strength, some men lead with soul. Most of us stumble between all these different types of masculinity, right? For all of us, we're caught between the man we were taught to be and the man we're becoming. And growth, generally, means moving into the parts of ourselves that are not developed in the ways that I just said. In my view, it's also important in the masculine to have a practice, a spiritual practice, if you will, that takes you beyond yourself. I don't really know that you can get super far without that. Maybe you do ayahuasca. Maybe you do LSD. Maybe you go to church and pray. Maybe Jesus is your thing, or Muhammad, right? I'm a Buddhist myself, right? I'm a Zen, ordained Zen priest. For me, mindfulness, meditation, the strict discipline and container of Zen that just rips you apart, makes a mockery of your ego, that works for me. I'm kind of an intense guy, though, so like the intense path is my path. But you have to have a practice that shows you a truth beyond yourself, a truth deeper than yourself, beyond all these stupid fucking identities, right? Masculine, feminine, American, European, white, black, right? Nah. Don't waste too much of your life worrying about identity. Do enough to get you where you need to be, and then get busy with your life. Because your life's going to end, and everyone you love, their lives are going to end too. Everything is on fire. If you can know that in your heart, it changes the way you behave, it changes the way you act. It's not what would I do if I have 1 year left to live, right? You're going to die. You're only here for a limited amount of time. It would behoove us to act accordingly. Okay, I think that's enough. Let me look at the questions now, and I see we have quite a few in the chat. Put my eyeballs on, and let's see what we have here. Okay. Oh, yeah, no visuals, just my mug talking at you. Okay, I'm just looking at. Yeah, okay. So John says we cannot talk about toxic masculinity in a productive way without talking about toxic femininity. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, John. I would actually love to have a woman on here, and that's part of what I'll plan to do, to talk about that. I think it would be better from a woman's point of view than from my point of view. It's likely going to be some projection if I'm talking about it. But there is toxic masculinity, yes. There is healthy masculinity, yes. Is there toxic femininity? Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it. And I agree. It needs to be part of the conversation, and part of any real intelligent conversation. Okay. Sorry, there's a lot of comments here. See, John is also saying that, I make an assumption about where men are in life based on who I interact with. That's certainly true. There are millions of midlife men who are not materialistically successful who urgently need to be part of this kind of conversation, but mostly aren't because of the type of men leading these conversations. Let's widen the reach. Here, John. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. I hope you feel like maybe I'm succeeding. Brian asked, is there a place for other definitions? Of course. This is me ranting, right? Nicholas, I wonder if that's Nicholas that I know. He says, I don't hear data as saying third stage men as having no shadow. He goes to therapy. At least he did when I work with him. Well, that could be the case. I may have strawmanned his third stage a little bit. It's been quite a few years since I read it. Yeah. Okay. And Nicholas is also saying, Nicholas is calling me out for oversimplifying David Data's point of view. I'm going to concede guilty as charged. He says that I'm leaving out a key part of his model. The masculine as freedom that commits to a purpose. I think that's true. Data does something else I'm not hearing here. Both men and women have masculine and feminine. Totally agree. Conflating man with masculine and woman with feminine reduces to deeper psychospiritual issues, which I totally agree with. I mean, that's what I was saying. We're all kind of all things. You are all 9 types of the Enneagram. You are all 16 types of the Myers-Briggs. You are both masculine and feminine. You are both human and non-human, right? I think these things are true across the board, which I hope I got into when I broke down the identity piece. John says, please do not equate mindfulness with Zen. I kind of agree. Okay. All right, folks. Any other questions? Feel free to chat or call in and give a moment for that. Thanks for the feedback, John, Nicholas. Good stuff. Good pushbacks. Okay, folks. Well, thank you for listening. I hope it was enjoyable. As I said, this is just sort of a shot out of the cannon here to get this conversation started. I'll be talking a lot more about this, and I'll be bringing in people who can hold a little more nuance than I can and have more expertise than I do. But thank you for being on the ride with me. If you want to learn more about me, keithmartinsmith.com. And it's great being on here today. Look forward to seeing y'all in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, the show is going to be a controversial one. We're going back into Trump territory, and the title is Why Trump is Needed. Yeah, I'll see you then.